The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking the silence of the evening. Maya's heart skipped when she saw the name on the screen: Damien. Her breath caught in her throat, memories flooding back like a storm she thought she had outrun. It had been years since he was locked away, years since she'd buried the nightmare he left behind. But now, he was free. And he wasn't coming back to make amends. He was coming to destroy her. "I'll see you soon, Maya. And when I do, your secrets will be exposed." She stared at the screen, a cold shiver running down her spine. Nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Maya sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. She stared at her cup of coffee, the steam swirling above it as if the fog in her mind would clear with one deep breath. But it didn't. That morning, a message had come through, unexpected and unsettling. Damien was out. He was back. It had been years since he was locked away, and during those years, Maya had rebuilt her life quietly, cautiously, but decisively. But now, the quiet terror gnawed at her insides. He's here. He's free. Her hands trembled, clutching the coffee mug a little too tightly. The heat from the ceramic didn't warm her. What did it mean for her now? Her past, something she'd buried so deep it hardly felt real, had just erupted back into her present. She closed her eyes, willing the panic to subside. David's voice echoed from the hallway. He was home early from work, smiling, like nothing had changed. He was always so steady, so unwavering. Everything that Maya had longed for when she was with Damien. But now, with Damien's return, her illusion of peace cracked, like a painting slashed down the middle. The life she'd built with David, the trust they had built, was fragile. The scars from her marriage to Damien weren't just emotional, they were a part of her now. Every touch, every whisper of tenderness from David felt like a reminder of what she had lost, of the traumas she'd never really escaped. The anger she'd never fully dealt with roiled beneath the surface, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it buried. "I'm just making dinner," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. The thought of Damien, so close, set her heart pounding. She didn't want to ruin what she had, but her fears, her secret, had the power to tear it all apart. "It's not over," she thought. "It will never be over." Maya paced back and forth in the living room, her fingers twitching nervously as she replayed the conversation she'd overheard earlier on the street. Damien wasn't just back to cause chaos, he was back to expose her. He knew, or at least, he suspected. HIV. She had never told David. The diagnosis had come years ago, a whisper in the dark, something she tried to ignore but couldn't. Damien's actions had infected her, and she had lived with that heavy burden, alone. She'd kept it hidden, afraid that it would destroy everything. David would leave her. And she couldn't bear it. David had never suspected a thing. He believed in her, he trusted her. But as the days passed, and Damien's threats loomed larger, Maya felt the walls closing in. "He's coming for you, Maya, and when he does, there's no more hiding." Damien had always been unpredictable, dangerous. But now, his return was not just about picking up where they left off. He wasn't interested in reconciliation. No, Damien's mind was focused on something darker, something that went deeper than his old wounds. He wanted to expose her. He wanted to rip everything away, make her feel the same loneliness and despair she had made him feel when she left. But it wasn't just the rejection. It was the secret, the one thing he hadn't known. He wanted to destroy her, not just physically or emotionally, but publicly. To expose her to the world. As he watched her from the shadows, he saw his chance. Her fear was a kind of power. She had betrayed him, and now it was his turn. "You'll regret leaving me, Maya. I'll make sure of that." Days turned into restless nights. Maya could no longer sleep, her body tense with fear. Each time the door creaked, each time a car passed by their house, she felt her heart leap into her throat. Damien wasn't just a name in the past anymore, he was a real, tangible threat, his presence suffocating her. She couldn't stop thinking about the words she had heard him say, how he threatened to reveal everything. The fear twisted inside her like a knot she couldn't untie. It was a war inside her, between the need to protect her family and the overwhelming need to keep the truth buried, even if it meant losing herself in the process. David noticed the changes. He saw how she pulled away when he tried to touch her, when he reached out to talk about their future. He couldn't understand why she was slipping away, but Maya's fears were too great to voice. "I'm fine," she'd say, forcing a smile, hiding the guilt that twisted her stomach into knots. David wasn't stupid. He could tell she wasn't fine, but every time he pushed for answers, she pushed back harder, retreating into the coldness she had known for too long. She wanted to keep him safe, but it was too late for that. Damien had already cracked her walls, and no matter how hard she tried, the cracks were widening. As Damien's presence in the town grew bolder, the storm inside Maya only intensified. The guilt from her secret, the shame, and the endless fear of losing everything, her family, her love, dragged her into a spiral she could no longer control. "I just need to be alone," she whispered one night, her back to David as she sat on the edge of their bed. David didn't argue, but the hurt was in his eyes. He knew she wasn't being honest. But neither of them had any idea just how close to the edge they were. The past was coming for her. And this time, there would be no escape. Maya stared at the reflection in the mirror, the woman who had come so far but still felt like a stranger in her own skin. Her life had changed since Damien, her ex-husband, had been imprisoned. She'd remarried David, a man who was everything Damien was not: gentle, understanding, and kind. David didn't just love her, he made her believe she could be happy again. She had a job she liked, a small circle of friends, and a home filled with laughter, things she hadn't thought possible after years of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of Damien. Yet, when she looked into the mirror, she could see the cracks. The woman staring back was no longer broken, but the remnants of her painful past remained hidden just below the surface. Every decision she made was influenced by the fear that if anyone, David included, knew the full extent of her past, they'd abandon her. The guilt of that hidden truth was like a weight she could never lift. She loved David, but the invisible walls she built between them only grew higher as time passed. "Dinner's almost ready," she called, trying to push the thoughts from her mind. She had to pretend to be happy. Pretend everything was fine. Because the truth was, it never truly was. The dinner table was quiet, as it usually was. David chatted about his day, recounting small victories at work and plans for their weekend, but Maya's mind was 1,000 miles away. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the wine glass. She could feel the cold sweat along her back, the unease gripping her chest. He couldn't know. She couldn't tell him. Not about Damien, not about the darkest part of her life. David was good to her. He had been since the day they met. But Maya had never been completely honest with him. Her secret was like a silent storm. It hung over every kiss, every moment they shared, even as they slept side by side. She'd never told him about the HIV diagnosis. How could she? She'd lived with it for years, all while keeping her fears locked away from him. She didn't want to hurt him, didn't want to risk the fragile peace they had built. But the return of Damien, like a ghost haunting her past, threatened everything. "Are you okay?" David's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up and forced a smile. "Yeah," she lied, the words coming out hollow. "Just tired." David looked at her, concern deepening in his eyes. But he didn't press. He never did. It wasn't until later that night, when she saw the news, that the past truly came rushing back. Damien was out. He was free. The words burned into her memory. She sat there, frozen, as the screen flashed his mugshot, now a familiar face after years of silence. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped. The world outside might have moved on, but in her mind, it was as if time had rewound to those years she had spent trapped in her marriage. She could still hear Damien's voice in her ear, still feel his hands on her, the way he'd belittle her with cruel words, the way he made her believe she was worthless. Damien's release wasn't just a legal matter. It was a signal. A message that everything she had fought for, everything she had tried to rebuild, could come crashing down in an instant. She had buried her fear so deeply over the years, but now, it was all surfacing, threatening to drown her. She picked up her phone and saw a message, a number she didn't recognize but that could only be one person. "You can't hide forever, Maya. I'll see you soon." Her stomach churned as dread spread through her like poison. In the days that followed, Maya felt like she was being watched. She'd catch a glimpse of someone lingering on the street, standing in the corner of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. She couldn't stop scanning the streets as she drove, feeling her pulse quicken at every unfamiliar car or person. Each knock at the door sent her heart into overdrive. It was stupid. She knew it. Damien was back, and he had his own agenda, but every moment of her life had become a trap she couldn't escape. He was out there, somewhere, knowing things about her that no one else could ever understand. David noticed the change in her. He saw her jump at the sound of the doorbell. He saw her looking over her shoulder when she left the house. "What's going on, Maya?" he asked one evening, his tone soft, but serious. "You're not yourself lately." She hesitated, her breath catching. "Nothing. Just, tired. Work's been stressful." David didn't press, but she saw the doubt in his eyes. It was the first crack in the foundation of their life together. And the more she pulled away, the further Damien's shadow loomed over them. David was used to Maya's moods. He knew her well enough to know when something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He'd tried everything, talking, holding her, just being there, but she was slipping away from him, and he couldn't understand why. He wasn't sure if it was work, or something else, perhaps their marriage, but something felt off. He started noticing her habits more closely. The way she checked her phone constantly, the way she started locking the doors at night, even in the house. The distance between them, the way she seemed distracted and unwilling to talk about her day, made him feel like an outsider in their own home. "Maya," he said one night, gently taking her hand in his, "we're supposed to be a team. What's going on? You can talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll get through it." Maya's eyes flickered, her breath catching for a moment. He had no idea. No idea about the weight she carried, the secrets she had buried so deep. She wanted to tell him, to let him in, but fear stopped her. Fear of what it might do to him, to their life together. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely audible. She shook her head, unwilling to let the truth spill. "I can't lose you." David's brow furrowed. "Maya, we can't fix something if you don't tell me what's broken." But she stayed silent. The space between them grew, and it felt like the walls were closing in. Damien had always been good at getting under people's skin. Maya knew this better than anyone. His return to town wasn't subtle, it was deliberate, like a shadow creeping over her life. It began with small, almost insignificant signs that slowly built into a force she couldn't ignore. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she first saw him. Maya had just left the grocery store and was loading her bags into the trunk of her car when she saw him standing across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost. He hadn't changed much. His dark eyes were still as cold and calculating as she remembered. When he caught her gaze, a sinister smile spread across his face. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Maya's heart skipped a beat as she quickly got into her car, locking the door behind her. He didn't move, just stood there watching. She stared ahead, refusing to acknowledge him, but the unease in her chest grew. She started the car and drove away, her hands tight on the steering wheel, but Damien's presence lingered in her mind long after she turned the corner. The next day, a message appeared on her phone, "I saw you today. We should talk soon." She couldn't breathe. He was watching her. He had come for her, and she could already feel his reach tightening. What was his game now? What did he want? The threats began small, but they were never far from her mind. Damien made his presence known, always lurking in the periphery, watching her. Maya couldn't escape the sense of dread that followed her wherever she went. He was taunting her, pulling at the delicate threads of her fragile life. Then came the first real sign that her secret would soon be exposed. It came one afternoon while Maya was at work, sitting in her office, her mind a million miles away. She heard a knock at her door, and without thinking, she looked up to see a familiar face, one she hadn't expected to see in years. Damien. He stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame with a smug smile plastered across his face. Her heart froze, and for a moment, it felt as if the room had closed in around her. "Damien," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What the hell are you doing here?" He grinned wider. "Just came to say hello. I figured you'd be at work, and I thought we could catch up. We've got so much to talk about, don't we?" Maya stood up, feeling the blood drain from her face. "I don't want anything to do with you. Get out." His eyes glinted with malice. "I know your secret, Maya. You think I didn't figure it out? All those years, you never told anyone, did you? Not even David?" Maya's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch. He knew. Damien took a step closer, his voice a low murmur now. "I've been waiting for the right moment. Don't worry, Maya, I'll make sure he finds out. Everyone will know what kind of person you really are." That night, Maya couldn't sleep. Her mind raced. Damien's words echoed in her head over and over again. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let David know. Her marriage, everything she had fought for, was on the line. She couldn't live with the shame anymore. But what choice did she have? She had to confront Damien. She had to make him stop. The next morning, she found him again, this time at a local cafe. He was sitting at a corner table, sipping coffee, like he was in no rush. Maya walked over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Damien, you have to stop this. You've made your point. I've already suffered enough," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He looked up at her, his cold eyes narrowing. "Suffered? You think you've suffered? I haven't even started yet." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You think you can hide from me, Maya? I know what you've been hiding. I know what you did." Maya's throat tightened. "Please, don't do this. It's in the past. Let it stay there. If you expose me, you'll ruin everything, not just for me, but for David too." Damien laughed darkly, shaking his head. "David doesn't deserve to live in a lie. He deserves to know what kind of woman he married. I'll give him the truth, Maya. Don't worry." Her hands clenched into fists. "I'll do anything. Just stop. Please." Her voice cracked as the desperation seeped through. Damien studied her for a long moment, a wicked gleam in his eyes. "You'll do anything? Anything at all? I think you will. But don't forget I'm the one holding the cards now." The following days were a blur of tension and dread. Damien's words hung over Maya like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every interaction, every moment of her life. She could feel herself slipping. The woman she had been, the woman she was trying so desperately to be, was fading away. her relationship with David began to unravel. He sensed the change in her. The fear in her eyes, the way she flinched at every phone call, every knock on the door. The wall between them grew higher with every passing day. David tried to talk to her. "Maya, what's going on? You're not yourself. I'm worried about you." But Maya pushed him away, telling him she was fine, that everything was under control. She couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't let him see how broken she was. How much danger they were both in. One night, she went to bed before David, lying in the darkness, her body stiff with tension. He tried to hold her, but she pulled away. "Maya, please. What are you hiding from me?" David whispered, his voice heavy with concern. She closed her eyes, the weight of her guilt crashing down on her. "I'm not hiding anything," she replied, her voice hoarse, but she knew he didn't believe her. The distance between them deepened. The cracks in their relationship widened, and Maya couldn't stop it. The harder she tried to protect him, the further away he seemed. And Damien's influence continued to loom over her like a dark specter, inching closer with every passing moment. David had always been patient with Maya, but lately, his patience was wearing thin. He couldn't understand what was going on, couldn't explain the shift in her behavior. He had tried everything, talking to her, reassuring her, even giving her space. But now, something had changed in him. The worry was too much. He had to know. "Maya, I can't keep doing this. You're pushing me away, and I don't know why. What's going on? You're not telling me the truth. I can see it." Maya turned away, tears welling in her eyes. "David, please. I'm just tired. I'm not feeling well, okay? I just need a little time." David's voice cracked. "I'm here for you. Always have been. But you're shutting me out, and I can't fix anything if you don't let me in." Her heart broke for him. But there was no way out. She couldn't let him in. If he knew, it would destroy them. And so, she lied. Again. The confrontation had been building for days, tension, fear, anger, all swirling inside Maya until it became a storm she could no longer control. She had avoided him, tried to push him out of her life, but Damien's shadow loomed larger with each passing day. Tonight, she couldn't run anymore. She had to face him, to try and end this nightmare before it consumed her completely. She drove to the place where she knew Damien would be. A seedy bar at the edge of town, somewhere dark and forgotten, just like him. Her hands gripped the wheel, the tension in her chest almost unbearable. She hadn't been this afraid in years, but now there was a sense of resolve settling inside her. She was done being his victim. If he wanted to destroy her, she would make sure he knew that she wouldn't go down quietly. When she walked into the bar, the dim lights made everything feel foreign. And there, in the back corner, was Damien waiting for her. His presence was almost tangible, his eyes dark and intent on her as she approached. "Maya," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I knew you'd come. I didn't think you had it in you, but here we are." "I'm done, Damien," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You've had your fun. But this is over. I'm not going to let you destroy me anymore." Damien chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Destroy you? Maya, you did that all on your own. But I'm not just going to let you walk away. No, I'm going to make sure the whole world knows who you really are." His words cut through her like a knife, but something inside her snapped. Years of torment, of pain, of keeping this secret to protect those she loved, it all came rushing back. The rage she had buried for so long, the desire to protect her life and her family, it all boiled over. Without thinking, she stepped forward, face to face with him. "You don't get to control me anymore," she spat, her eyes wild. You don't get to hold me hostage with my past. Damien's smile faded, his eyes darkening with contempt. He stood up slowly, moving toward her, towering over her. The physical space between them seemed to narrow, the tension thickening with every step. You think you can get away from me, he sneered. You think you can just walk away and have your perfect little life with David? I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to ruin everything you love. In that moment, something shifted in Maya. She couldn't let him win. Not this time. The fear that had gripped her for so long turned into something else, a raw, primal need to protect herself, to stop Damien from taking everything from her. As Damien reached for her, his hand grabbing her wrist with a force that made her gasp, she reacted. The anger, the years of suppression, flooded her body. Her free hand, shaking but determined, grabbed a glass bottle from the nearby table, the sharp edge cutting into her palm as she swung it up toward his head. The sound of glass shattering was like a release of all the pent-up fear and hatred she had carried for years. Damien staggered back, blood trickling down his forehead, his grip loosening just enough for Maya to break free. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel alive, powerful for the first time in years. "Get away from me," she screamed, her voice hoarse. But Damien didn't back down. "You think that's going to stop me?" he growled, wiping the blood from his forehead. He was furious now, a wild animal backed into a corner, but his eyes held that same cruel gleam. "You think you can hurt me and walk away?" Maya didn't care anymore. She was done running. Done being afraid. And in the chaos of that moment, she saw the opportunity to end it, to put an end to everything Damien had put her through. She lunged at him again, but this time, she was no longer the terrified woman who had lived in his shadow. This time, she was fighting for her life. The door swung open suddenly, and a figure stepped into the dim light. Maya's heart skipped a beat. It was David. He had followed her, worried when she hadn't come home after hours of silence. "Maya," he shouted, his voice filled with panic as he saw her standing there, the broken bottle in her hand and Damien bleeding on the floor. His eyes darted between them, confusion and fear overtaking him. "David, get out of here!" Maya screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the chaos. She couldn't let him get involved. She couldn't let him see what she had become in her desperate attempt to protect their life together. David took a step closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, looking between Maya and Damien, who was now leaning against the wall, clutching his bleeding head. The realization hit him too late. He could see the truth in their eyes, the truth that had been kept from him for so long. "Maya," David's voice broke, his heart shattering as he pieced it all together. You've been hiding this from me." Maya's chest tightened. The man she loved, the man she had tried so hard to protect from the horror of her past, was standing here, witnessing it all. She had kept him in the dark, but now, the truth was out. She couldn't lie anymore. "David, please," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to lose you." David's face twisted in anguish. "How could you keep something like this from me?" His voice was barely audible, filled with heartbreak. "All this time, I thought we were building a life together. And now, I don't know what to believe." Damien, seizing the opportunity, launched himself at David, knocking him to the ground. The room erupted into chaos once again as the two men struggled, fists flying. But in the heat of the moment, David's panic took over. In a desperate attempt to defend himself, he pushed Damien away, but the force was too much. Damien hit the edge of the table with a sickening thud, his body crumpling to the floor. Maya froze, her heart racing as she looked at Damien's motionless body. David scrambled to his feet, his face pale, his hands shaking. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Damien was gone. And it was David who had caused it? The room fell silent. Maya stood there, her mind a whirlpool of emotions, but she felt numb, detached from reality. Damien was dead. He was gone. But in that moment, it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like relief. It just felt empty. She looked at David, who was kneeling beside Damien's body, his face full of guilt and horror. Maya's heart shattered for him. He hadn't meant for this to happen. But the consequences were undeniable. Maya, David whispered, looking up at her, his face a mask of despair. What have we done? Maya didn't answer. She couldn't. She could only stare at the blood-stained floor, the weight of the night pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The past had come full circle, and there was no going back. David stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the lifeless body of Damien. I didn't mean for this to happen, Maya, he whispered. But it did. And now, we have to face the consequences. Maya couldn't speak. She couldn't even move. The truth was out, and with it, her life as she knew it had ended. There would be no going back from this. David pulled her close, but she couldn't find the strength to hold him back. The damage was done. And whatever came next, they would face it together. But for now, they were left in the aftermath of a past that had come back to claim them.